Well, there's a look at CannTrust shares this morning. They are surging 17%, but of course this is a stock that had slid 60% over the course of this month. It is rallying. With the news, the CEO, Peter Aceto, was fired. The chairman, Eric Paul, forced to resign. The overhaul coming amid an intensifying controversy. New evidence came to light this week, including right here on BNN Bloomberg, that Aceto wasn't just aware of unlicensed activity at the pot company, but that he gave the go-ahead to staff. We're going to dig deeper into this story now. Our own David George Kosh has been leading BNN Bloomberg's reporting on this story, and joining us in studio alongside David is the former chairman and co-CEO of Canopy Growth, Bruce Linton. Bruce, nice to see you. Thanks so much for being with us here today.
Very relaxing. I find this unemployment thing giving more time with you.
Well, we're going to talk about that and certainly talk about the evolution of your journey and what you're thinking next. But you're joining us on a very busy Friday morning here. David has all morning been sort of setting up the landscape for us. What is your immediate reaction to the news this morning on CannTrust?
Well, I don't think Peter, somebody's going to take the fall. It's Peter, but I don't necessarily know that that's going to be the final end, because I think he came into a play that was probably half or three-quarters way finished. And when you're a new CEO to some of these places, if you're not from it, when you look at that area over there that's growing and that one that's growing, do you really know which one's licensed and things? So I think it'll probably turn out that there's quite a few more actors way before him who knew more than he did. Maybe he didn't stop the bus once he figured it out, but I suspect there's quite a lot more to it than simply firing one CEO.
Well, because when you say take the fall, I mean, I think David's own reporting on this story has alluded to what may or may not have been known on even if he wasn't the first person to be, well, he was at this company.
I think the email to notice was once he'd been there, it was a couple of weeks or a few weeks in, right? I don't know about you, but like when I enter a new job at a large multi-location facility, after 3 weeks, I'm still trying to figure out where the washrooms are at each of the facilities. And so I think that there is a learning curve and what do you know. So these things, I suspect, have many actors, and there will be a lot of house cleaning, and there will be a lot of digging. And I feel very awkward for the sector, because this is one of the first plays that actually attracted the Bank of America attention, re-IPO'd, got the spotlight. And so the spotlight doesn't go away when bad things happen. And so it's going to reflect not well in the U.S. at some of those accounts probably that trusted this opportunity.
I mean, it's a good point, David. I mean, we talk about the pros and cons of the U.S. market, and I know we'll talk more about it with Bruce, but everyone has been obsessed with getting the attention of U.S. investors and listing there. What we've talked a lot less about this morning is all the shareholder lawsuits that have come out of the U.S. market as a result of this for CannTrust, which is going to be a learning lesson, I would imagine, for a lot of Canadian players.
Yeah, I believe there's 15, at the very least, class actions that have been filed right now, none of which, of course, have been certified at this point. But given the fact that CannTrust is trading on the New York Stock Exchange, as well as its employ of U.S. bankers for its latest prospectus, this scandal is likely drawing the attention of the SEC. I've reached out to the SEC for comment whether or not that they are conducting any investigation on this matter, and they are declining right now to comment. But you better presume that there is some sort of activity going on trying to determine if there is any securities regulatory issues at fault here, and whether or not Mr. Aceto and Mr. Paul would be found to be potentially liable there.
Yeah.
You want to say?
Well, I think, for sure, like in the context of Canopy, when we were doing deals, even before we were on U.S. exchange, from time to time, you would get an inquiry from FINRA saying, in this transaction, do you note any of these names who've been trading your stock through it? That's a big difference from what goes on in Canada. And so I think a lot of these companies that are running off to the U.S. might want to say, am I operating in a way that is actually going to be governed?
So I just want to take a step back and talk about, because David and I talked about this earlier this morning, just the idea that there was so much pressure on everybody, the government, the companies, your former company, to get ready for legalization. And what happens when you have all that pressure? I mean, how much of that plays in, do you think, to this story at CannTrust?
If it does, that's a big problem, right? Everybody's under pressure all the time, but it doesn't mean you have, this is a highly regulated industry. I'm under pressure, therefore I want to cut a corner. Well, that behavior doesn't ever end. And so I don't know that one way to avoid feeling pressure as you approached rec was to actually have been working at it for 2 or 3 years before. The election had happened a couple years before. Anybody who knows politics, if you get a majority government and a primary promise, that means you have to do it or you don't win again. And so the night of the election, I felt like throwing up because it was really clear that the Liberals were not going to have a minority government, therefore they had no excuse, and therefore we had to get a lot of work done because rec was happening. Didn't know when.
So this doesn't, to you, mean that there are other players out there that were in the same situation, and we might see further disclosures from the company about Health Canada investigations into what happened, or?
Well, I think we've seen in the sector 4, 5, 6 occasions where companies didn't follow the rules, and the result was they either got bought or got squeezed out. And well, the only one that's actually recovered well from it was Organigram, when they were organic, but they were actually not using things permitted, so they weren't organic, and they came out of that okay. But in Canopy, we'd acquired a company called Metrum. Metrum had a problem that they were spraying stuff on things that they shouldn't. You have this license where people are operating in an area that everybody in the sector knows that on Friday afternoons, if you're going to get licensed, you get an email. And when the email comes in, it's through a whole bunch of things that you've applied to, so you know exactly where the space is, you know exactly what's been licensed, and it's impossible not to understand what you got.
Your experience in working with Health Canada was positive? Very
positive. In fact, when we got our first license in November of 2013, the two bureaucrats showed up, and they put us through the ringer. And we got the license, and I felt great about paying my taxes because I felt that this was one of the most stringent, well thought through, took us on angles. And I went, you know what, I'm very happy because this means the riffraff aren't getting licenses.
David, one of the things that, I mean, just to Bruce's point, we talked about the evolution of some of those channel checks from regulators, and the former president at CannTrust had told us here on the show that they moved from a system at CannTrust from having people necessarily come to the facility each time to sort of that online system, and then there was this allegation about walls being built which essentially deceived regulators potentially on what cannabis was being grown at the facility.
Yeah, and I'd like to get Bruce's thoughts on this too. Was Health Canada at one point just didn't have the resources enough to conduct all these inspections ahead of legalization of recreational cannabis, given that there was a lot of applicants for that, and they moved to a system where they allowed more online response to inspections that may have created the situation where at least CannTrust wanted to, allegedly, of course, build these fake walls to hide cannabis. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the process by which you get licenses has improved and become more efficient. Mm-hmm. You take pictures. This is the area I want to have licensed. These are the cameras, and you submit them, and they review them, and you give all the information. I believe that if you don't attempt to mislead the regulator with what you provide them, you will get licensed what you should get licensed. In the case of Canopy, I don't believe we ever attempted to mislead the regulator, and the result was we always knew what we had licensed and we knew what we didn't have licensed. And so I don't buy it that it's actually on the government. There may be ways that it could be a little bit of this or a little bit of that, but fundamentally, if people are trying to get away with something, which I think clearly were, I think they were using more unlicensed area than they had licensed area. Like, it's not like I was going 5 kilometers over the speed limit. No, you were actually going 3 times the speed limit, sir. And there are penalties for 3 times the speed limit. I think you actually probably have to get your car taken away. So I just, this is not a minor infraction. This is a lot more than that, I think.
So you said at the beginning you think more is coming. We've seen the CEO fired and the chairman asked to resign. What do you think comes next?
Well, I think, so any company that's going to buy them, if I was running that company, the last thing I want is the circus that comes with the acquisition result of owning the shares, meaning you got, I think, 15 or 17 class action lawsuits. I would want to leave that mess over there, and I would want to buy the assets at whatever price, buy the assets and run the business and let somebody else deal with the big pile of problem. And so I don't know what the transaction will look like, but someone's going to have to, I think, step in who's trusted with Health Canada, make the acquisition, solve the problem, and get it put away before the election comes. And so I think that there's a window of time, which is right now, should have been a week or two ago, that they do this.
Do you think it's an election issue?
Well, I think this is a big mess, which could be, and what I want the election to be about isn't this. I think the election should be about the fact that cannabis companies have created more jobs in Canada in the last year than all the tech companies whose stocks are booming.
Yeah.
And they're in the news today, Google and all these. We've created more jobs, and we've created them not in urban centers, but where they need them. So I don't want to have a sideshow.
And before we take a quick break here, we're going to be talking a lot more with Bruce. Just in terms of what you know about what's happening at a business, when you were at Canopy, did you guys kick the tires on CannTrust? I mean, was this a business you thought about, hey, should we buy their business?
I looked at every business and thought we should buy that business until I concluded otherwise. So these guys have had good business. They have done a good job of getting oils extracted and presented to patients and taking good market share on that. Whether or not they have other problems, who knows, but they actually had a good underlying business.
So, David, where do we go very quickly before we go to break? Where do we go from here?
I'm waiting for Health Canada to make its enforcement action on CannTrust, and we're waiting to hear back from the board as to what further actions they would like to do in terms of its independent committee.
And I'm getting from you, Bruce, that you don't think they're going to lose licenses to be a grower here sort of outright.
Sometimes you don't lose them, but they get parked for a year. So you've seen in the past where people went offside, they didn't lose their license, they just lost the right to sell things for a year. That's kind of hurtful.
What would that mean for, they're not selling cannabis right now?
Yeah, but if that goes on for a year, you know what is being sold? Everybody who holds a stock. And so I think the better outcome for the company is to say, you know what? We had our turn, it's over, and I'm going to now hand over to that company in whatever format I can do a transaction, and new folks are in charge.